In this class, we will discuss the decipherment of the Linear B language by this gentleman on the left, Michael Ventris. I showed you in a previous class that a whole bunch of tablets had been found. Not a whole bunch, but tablets had been found on excavations of Bronze Age sites, especially at Mycenae. Or I'm sorry, at Knossos. And early on, Arthur Evans, the excavator there, realized there was two types of scripts that he called Linear A and Linear B. Linear because that's just the shape of the writing, and there was two types. Although they shared a lot of letters. They're not really letters, but you get the idea of script, of parts of their script. They were for two different languages. And as we'll see, the ones on the bottom, the Linear B, have been deciphered. The ones on the right have not been. We did discuss the Festos disc and some hieroglyphic bars that I showed you before that have not been deciphered. And Linear A has not been deciphered either, the one on the right here. But since the 50s, Linear B on the bottom has. And once again, this gentleman on the left, Michael Ventris, would decipher the language. So these were found early on. Evans was finding them at Knossos, and they're being found elsewhere. And there was only one thing that scholars agreed on concerning the linear tablets, was that they could not be Greek. And the reason was this. It was because of this guy here on the left, Thucydides, who wrote a book called The History of the Peloponnesian War that took place in the 5th century BC. You've probably had a chance to read parts of it in DWC. Now, the Peloponnesian War is going to take place a lot later, and we'll get to that when we get to that. But in the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides talks about the history of warfare. And he talks about the Trojan War. And he says that the Greeks that Homer refers to, and I should add, by the way, Homer did not call them Greeks. He called them Hellenes or Achaeans, but he didn't use the word Greeks. But in any case, that's what we use now, and that'll give you an idea of what we're talking about. He said, they did not speak Greek, so there was some, pre-Greek language was being used. And so this pretty much, solidified everything for scholars. As it turns out, he was wrong too. As I mentioned, these sites, these tablets are being found all over Bronze Age sites, but just in spatterings. But it would be the excavations at Pylos that would preserve for us a really, a good amount of these tablets, sufficient enough to allow the decipherment, which is frequently the case. You got to have a whole bunch of information, of data, before you can decipher. Here's the plan of Pylos. I showed you this to you before. You recognize the megaron in the central area there, that circle, which was a hearth, and then 4 columns around it. We see the bases. And that's the room that, as I mentioned before, Homer talks about Odysseus killing all the people, or all the suitors, and Homer refers to it as a megaron. And he refers to megarons in other places. He refers to the one at Pylos here as Nestor's palace. Nestor is in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and at other places. Now, we look at the megaron in this hearth area. We go from room 6 down to room 5. The second entrance room, or atrium, before you walk in. And then if you go to the left of it, between room 17 and 12, that's the archive room. And that's where all these tablets were found. I want you to pay attention to that because its location is important. There was records basically kept, as we'll learn, from the of basically taxation and offerings and tributes that were brought to the king. There is no poetry in it. There's nothing. There's no sort of historical events. There, as people like to say, they're more like shopping lists. They're just lists of goods that were brought to the palace by the people who lived around it as for purposes of taxation or tribute or what have you. Another way to look at the location is if we go way to the bottom of the slide that I just showed you and looked up towards the hearth room, you can see it that way, and you can see near the center, in the center on the top part of it, you can see the base of the hearth there, and you can see the two atrias or there's two walls sticking from the left and the right. Now, if you go into that first section of walls and then go to the left, that's where the archive room is located. Let's look at it from another angle. We can look at it from the other side, and I've shown you this slide before, showing the megaron there with these pithoi that were embedded into clay benches behind the megaron. And once again, if you go this time out of the megaron and after the first exit way, you go to the right, that's where the archive room was located. And it was full of a whole bunch of tablets that were in different shapes and with different amounts of writing. But it was full of, in this case, only linear B. And they were not meant to be preserved for a long time. They were not like Mesopotamian or Egyptian tablets where they were, intentionally fired in a kiln so they could be preserved forever. These were to be used in a very temporary fashion. That is to say, they would write. They would wait till the clay was leather hard, and then they would write on them, and they would keep records as long as they needed them, and then they could just wet down the clay again and clean off the writing, and use them again. The reason these are preserved is because they were burnt in the destruction level of the site. This is in the very top layer of the archaeological site, in the destruction layer, and we'll talk about why we think these sites were destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age. We're not there yet, but they got fired accidentally and are preserved for us. And so one of the reasons we don't have tons of tablets is because these are preserved for us only by accident. The users of them did not intend them to be preserved. Now, Blegen, who excavated this, the great American archaeologist Carl Blegen, was known to be quite lucky. And, we saw him at Troy. He went to several other sites we haven't had a chance to talk about yet. But he is, then he excavated Pylos or Pylos. And in his very first trench, in his very first what's called a pass, that is to say the first, taking off of soils, he comes across the archive room, which is incredibly lucky. And they are preserved. We can see all these clay tablets in the corner of the trench. By the way, those are not walls there. Those are just lines of dirt that have not yet been excavated on the left and top side there. But there's a pile of tablets that have been accidentally preserved for us due to the burning of the palace at the end. And this was at the site of, or at the time of 1931. As an interesting side story, the World War II is about to happen, and soon Greece would be invaded first by the Italians and then later by the Nazis, and Blegen would have to take these tablets and put them in a bank vault in Athens, and then wait out the war. And after the war ended, Greece fell into a civil war. And so basically, the 40s were pretty much wiped out for thorough study. But fortunately for us, Blegen had made a lot of drawings and records of what was written on these tablets. And he was sending them around to people, hoping they could be deciphered. But, they were, very close to deciphering it right there. And, the more tablets you have, the better. And then he had to stop, which must have been quite frustrating for him. Uh, the linear B tablets can take, a normal tablet shape as we see on the left here, and on the bottom, uh, we can see what's called a palm leaf. This is a shape that would fit into the size of your palm, quite frankly. They're not that big at all. And they would put lines across the tablets, just like we do, and then write from left to right, just like we do. And on the bottom there, you can make out what the a translation of it has been, and I'll come back to how this exactly works. But as you can read on the bottom there, it says a tripod cauldron of Cretan workmanship, and then it says one tripod cauldron with 1 foot, etc. And so these were things that were brought into the palace. But what I want you to pay attention to, and you can see this focus on the top here, the top reconstruction of that palm leaf on the bottom slide. You can see that there's drawings of things, of the objects that they're discussing, and then a whole bunch of scripts, of writings. And so that was quite interesting. And part of that could be figured out pretty quick, but it was the rest that was difficult to figure out. What we're getting here is, for example, once again, a pictogram and a logogram or a homophone. But one of the things he noticed was that the depiction for this man on the second from the right on the top was always associated with two symbols. And there was always the same two symbols. And he knew from Homer that the word for man was, or boy, was 2 syllables as well. And so if you go fourth from the right on the 4th line down, you see the co symbol, co. Now then go over, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more, and you see sort of a little X there. Not really an X, but a cross. And it says rho. Well, koros or koros in Greek means boy, in later Greek. But he would use this to figure out that it was, 1, a syllabary, and then 2, would, once he had that, he could start taking other words that Homer used, like for chariot, etc., or as is shown the top, horse, pig, helmet, woman, etc. And from Homer, figure out what was being written here. And so what it is called a syllabary, where the syllables are a combination of a consonant and a vowel, or just a vowel. But there's no simple consonants by themselves. There could be vowels by themselves, but no consonants. These are very cumbersome scripts because you need a whole bunch of logograms or homophones, and then you add them with the pictograms. So it wasn't the best of writing, but it was writing. I should add that nobody thought that or we shouldn't think that the people there were literate. They've recognized about 30 to 35 hands of scribes. So it was only certain people, and probably people in the palaces or the citadels, who would use this for recording goods being brought in and out. And so keep that in mind. I mean, we find linear A and linear B script identifying, for example, stuff that's contained in pottery, etc. So it could be, generally read, but it wasn't out there for everybody to read as books. And once again, there was nothing really to read other than commodities. So we're not getting any philosophical writings or epic poems. But the important thing is that they were speaking Greek during the Trojan War. And we didn't know this for the longest time. And Ventris was, poo-pooed for the longest of times. He was, as a matter of fact, there was some of my teachers did not accept the decipherment because it happened in the 1950s, and they were very, very, very reluctant to do so. And Ventris was not a archaeologist, by the way. He was a cryptographer. People who break codes, and he was a code breaker during World War II. He worked on the Enigma machine. I don't know if you know that machine that the Brits had, so they could decipher the Nazi codes. So he was very good at this sort of stuff, and he knew ancient languages, and he was very good with languages. And so he showed that linear B was, in fact, ancient Greek. And if we go back to this slide, we can see that there's once again there's linear A and linear B on the bottom right, and on the left it shows the syllabary and what the sounds that go with these images. And we have not deciphered linear A, but the linear B tablets post-date the linear A. And we're now and since linear A is primarily, though not completely, but primarily found on Crete, we believe it to be a Minoan language. And then the Mycenaeans in the late Bronze Age would take over Crete and take over the Aegean, and they would adopt the script, but use it for their own language, which was Greek. Just like we have the Latin script, but we use it for our language. And that's what they did here. But it was not a widely used language. And so it would die out at the end of the Bronze Age. But nevertheless, Greek now is a really old language. I mean, it's getting up there with like Chinese and stuff, or Hebrew. It's really, really an old language. And it's never been lost. Like, Hebrew, for example, was only spoken by rabbis for millennia. But Greek has been spoken, continuously. Now, granted, it has changed a lot over time. Homeric Greek is, it's hard to read when you even know if you're fluent in modern Greek and even good at ancient Greek. Homer is its own sort of special group, a special thing. But they were speaking Greek. And so that was really exciting and has really changed everything for us. I do want to add one little interesting historical note, and that is that Blake and Ventris were going through, corresponding back and forth about what was going on and his attempts to decipher it. And Ventris would send Blagan a letter saying, I think this is what it is. And Blagan was, that looks really good to me, but we have to go back and find more tablets. And he goes back after the war and indeed finds many more and finds that palm leaf that I showed you earlier and the transliteration of it, the translation of it. And so that would basically prove that Ventris was right. So this is a really spectacular discovery. And it's not easy to read. You have to be a specialist in it. It's pretty boring to read. There's still some discoveries here and there being made, but nothing compared to the Pylos archive room. That is our richest, group of evidence for linear B. And that would die out at the end of the Bronze Age. But we now know that the Mycenaeans indeed spoke Greek. And we'll continue on with Mycenae one last time and then get out of the Bronze Age in the next lecture. So, for example, we can see here the what they call the homophones on the right here. Those are basically the same as the logograms, and what's called the basic values on the left. And let's not worry about the details of those. But basically what we see here on the left is that they take a vow let's look at the top row. We see the A, E, I, O, U. And then they just combine that with consonants as they go through. So there's, da, da, did, do, do, ja, ja, jo, ju, ha, he, go, ku, etc. And once that was figured out, it was sort of interesting. Because that would end up explaining things a lot more simply. Now, to go back to one more slide here,